I'm Amanda, 32, and my whole life changed at my father's retirement dinner last spring. The banquet hall glittered with success as my father, Richard, raised his crystal glass. "My real children are the ones who made me proud," he announced to applause. Then his cold eyes found mine across the room. "You can leave," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Humiliation burned through me as I stood shakily. But then my husband stood too. What happened next redefined family for me forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. The moment my husband stood up that night changed everything, and I promise you'll want to hear how this ends. I grew up in Brooklyn, an affluent Boston suburb where success wasn't celebrated, but expected. Our colonial-style home with its manicured lawn looked picture-perfect from the outside. Inside was a different story. My father, Richard Harrington, wasn't just a banking executive. He was a man who measured love in achievements and disappointments. My mother, Elaine, was beautiful, quiet, and ultimately powerless against my father's domineering presence. She'd occasionally whisper comfort after his tirades, but never openly defied him. I lost her to breast cancer when I was 20, and with her went the only buffer between my father's expectations and my reality. My siblings were everything I wasn't. Jason, 4 years older, followed our father into finance, graduating from Wharton and climbing rapidly at a prestigious investment firm. Kimberly, 2 years my senior, became a cardiothoracic surgeon, collecting accolades like some people collect stamps. They were the golden children, the standard bearers, the ones who made our last name mean something, as my father often said. Then there was me. From childhood, I gravitated toward books and art, finding escape in stories when real life became too harsh. I can still remember sitting at our glossy black grand piano during my 12th birthday recital. Family friends filled our living room, and I was playing Debussy's Clair de Lune. My fingers trembled over the keys, and halfway through, I hit a wrong note. Just one. My father stood abruptly, straightened his tie, and walked out. The room fell silent except for the sound of the front door closing. I finished the piece with tears blurring my vision, but I finished it. That moment defined our relationship. One mistake was all it took to be deemed unworthy. College brought temporary freedom. I studied literature at Amherst, despite my father's insistence on business school. "You're throwing your life away on fairy tales," he said when I showed him my acceptance letter. I still went, funding my education through scholarships and part-time jobs, since he refused to pay for a useless degree. Those years taught me independence, but deepened my struggles with anxiety and self-worth. I'd accomplished something I was proud of, only to hear my father's voice in my head asking why it wasn't more. I dated occasionally, but relationships never lasted. I'd either pick men who reinforced my father's criticism or push away the good ones before they could discover I wasn't enough. Everything changed 3 years ago at a small bookstore in Cambridge. I was browsing the classic literature section when I reached for the last copy of a rare edition of Jane Eyre at the exact same moment as someone else. I looked up to find Scott Taylor with kind eyes and a warm smile that made something inside me settle for the first time. "You take it," he insisted. "Anyone hunting for Bronte deserves it more than me." We ended up talking for hours at the coffee shop next door. Scott was a software engineer who loved literature nearly as much as I did. He listened when I spoke. Actually listened, without checking his watch or preparing his next argument. When I mentioned my dream of starting a small publishing house for overlooked authors, he didn't laugh or call it impractical. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about my business plan. 6 months later, with Scott's encouragement and help with the financial projections, I launched Lighthouse Press. We specialized in literary fiction by diverse voices, starting small with just 2 titles our first year. By year 2, one of our books had won a regional award, and we'd expanded to publishing 6 titles annually. It wasn't making me rich, but it was making me proud. Scott and I married in a small ceremony at the Boston Public Library. My father didn't attend, claiming an important business meeting in Chicago. Jason sent an expensive but impersonal gift. Only Kimberly represented my side of the family, leaving immediately after the ceremony for a conference. "They don't deserve you," Scott whispered, as we danced at our reception, surrounded by friends and his loving family instead of mine. I hadn't spoken more than a few words to my father in nearly 2 years when the invitation to his retirement dinner arrived. After 40 years at First Atlantic Bank, Richard Harrington was stepping down as executive vice president, and there would be a formal celebration at the Hawthorne, Boston's most exclusive restaurant. "We don't have to go," Scott said, watching my hands tremble as I read the thick, cream-colored card. "Maybe this is his way of reaching out," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Maybe things will be different now that he's retiring." The night of the dinner, I stood before our bedroom mirror in a navy blue dress that had cost more than I'd usually spend. My hair was professionally styled, my makeup carefully applied to hide the shadows under my eyes from a week of stress-induced insomnia. "You look beautiful," Scott said, adjusting his tie in the mirror beside me. "I feel like I'm going to throw up," I admitted. A panic attack hit me just as we were about to leave. Scott sat with me on the edge of our bed, coaching me through the breathing exercises my therapist had taught me. His hand made slow circles on my back as my breathing gradually normalized. "We can still cancel," he reminded me. "No," I said, reapplying my lipstick with shaking hands. "I need to do this. I need to try one more time." As we drove downtown, Scott reached over and squeezed my hand. "Remember, no matter what happens tonight, you have people who love you for exactly who you are." I nodded, wishing I could believe him. But decades of conditional love had taught me otherwise. Deep down, I still thought I needed to earn the right to be loved. And tonight was one more chance to finally make my father proud. The Hawthorne stood like a beacon against the Boston skyline, its historic facade illuminated against the darkening spring evening. Scott handed our car to the valet, a young man in a crisp red uniform who opened my door with practiced elegance. As we approached the entrance, my heels clicked against the cobblestone walkway like a countdown. "Remember to breathe," Scott whispered, his hand steady at the small of my back. The maitre d' directed us to the private banquet room where my father's retirement celebration was already underway. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the crowd of about 70 people, most in formal attire, champagne flutes in hand. A string quartet played softly in the corner, nearly drowned out by the polite laughter and conversation of Boston's banking elite. I spotted Jason immediately, holding court near the bar. At 36, my brother had grown to resemble our father, with his tailored suit and confident stance. He was surrounded by admiring colleagues, his gold cufflinks catching the light as he gestured while telling some story that had his audience chuckling appreciatively. "Amanda," he said when he noticed us, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Didn't think you'd make it." He offered Scott a brief handshake before turning to the group. "This is my little sister and her husband. Amanda does something with books, don't you?" Before I could answer, he continued, "Scott, these are some colleagues from Blackstone Investment. We just closed the Reynolds merger last week." The conversation immediately returned to finance, with Jason not bothering to include us. Scott gave my hand a gentle squeeze as we excused ourselves. We found Kimberly near the hors d'oeuvres table, elegant in a red dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She was showing off an enormous diamond engagement ring to 2 women I didn't recognize.
June wedding at the plaza, she was saying. Thomas wanted Tuscany, but I told him the humidity would be terrible for photos. She spotted me and paused briefly. Amanda, you came. Her eyes flicked over my dress with subtle assessment. Navy is so reliable. She introduced Scott and me to her fiancé, Thomas, a neurosurgeon with perfect teeth and a Harvard accent. The conversation revolved around their upcoming wedding and recent medical conferences in Switzerland, before Kimberly excused herself to greet more important guests.
"Your siblings are exactly as advertised," Scott murmured as we moved away. I was reaching for a glass of champagne from a passing waiter when I felt a bony hand on my arm. Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, pulled me into a stiff hug that smelled of expensive perfume and judgment. "Amanda, darling," she said, air-kissing near my cheek, "you look healthy." The slight pause communicated volumes. Aunt Patricia had always sided with my father, reinforcing his standards as reasonable rather than punishing. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Try to make him proud tonight. It's important to him, especially with all his colleagues here." Before I could respond, she was already moving toward Kimberly, exclaiming over the engagement ring. The banquet room was a showcase of wealth and power. Crystal vases held arrangements of white roses and hydrangeas on every table. The bar featured top-shelf liquor and vintage wines. Waitstaff circulated with trays of delicacies, caviar on blini, seared scallops, tiny quiches. Around me, conversations centered on stock portfolios, vacation homes, and private schools. I finally spotted my father across the room, commanding attention in a circle of distinguished men. At 65, Richard Harrington remained imposing, his silver hair and patrician features marking him as someone accustomed to respect. He laughed at something one of the men said, and for a moment I saw a warmth I'd rarely experienced directed at me. Scott sensed my hesitation. "Want me to come with you to say hello?" I shook my head. I should do this alone. Taking a deep breath, I approached my father. He saw me coming, but continued his conversation until I was standing awkwardly at the edge of the circle. Finally, during a pause, he acknowledged me. "Amanda, you made it." His tone suggested a mild surprise rather than pleasure. "Congratulations on your retirement," I said, offering the gift bag containing an expensive fountain pen Scott had helped me select. "Thank you." He accepted it without looking inside. "Gentlemen, my youngest, Amanda. She's in publishing." "On my own small press, actually. We just had an author shortlisted for the Massachusetts Book Award." My father's expression didn't change. Amanda always had her head in the clouds, playing with books while her siblings took on real careers. The men chuckled obligingly. "Speaking of, Jason just closed a $40 million deal, and Kimberly is engaged to Dr. Thomas Whitfield, chief resident at Mass General." The clear message: their accomplishments were worth mentioning, mine were not. "It was nice seeing you," I said, quietly, retreating before the tears stinging my eyes could fall. Scott was waiting with a fresh glass of wine, which I gratefully accepted. "That bad?" "The usual," I managed, taking a large sip. The cocktail hour continued around us. I watched as my father moved through the room like a king holding court, accepting congratulations and reminiscing about his illustrious career. With each person he greeted warmly, the contrast to his coldness toward me became more pronounced. When it was time to be seated for dinner, I discovered we'd been placed at a table far from the main one, where my father, Jason, Kimberly, and other VIPs would sit. Our table mates included distant relatives and junior colleagues who seemed equally disappointed with their placement. "I'm Scott Taylor, Amanda's husband," Scott introduced himself cheerfully, undeterred by the seating politics. "You're Richard's daughter?" asked an older woman across from us. "The one who isn't a doctor or banker?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "I run a publishing company." "How nice," she said, with the same tone one might use to address a child's crayon drawing. "A hobby business." Throughout the three-course meal, I watched my father at the center table, laughing and engaged with those around him. Occasionally, he'd place a proud hand on Jason's shoulder or beam at something Kimberly said. It was a side of him I'd seen directed at my siblings, but never at me. Scott squeezed my hand under the table periodically, his silent support the only thing keeping me from walking out. The lamb was perfectly cooked, the wine exceptional, but everything tasted like ash in my mouth. After dessert was served, the formal speeches began. The bank CEO spoke about my father's contributions, his vision, his leadership. A longtime colleague shared humorous anecdotes about their early days in finance. Jason gave a polished speech about our father's professional legacy, managing to make it primarily about himself in the process. And then it was my father's turn. The room quieted as Richard Harrington rose and approached the microphone, commanding the space with practiced ease. My heart beat faster, hoping against hope that this moment, this public reflection on his life and career, might include some small acknowledgement of me. "Thank you all for coming tonight," my father began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the banquet hall. "Looking around this room, I see not just colleagues, but friends who have been part of a journey spanning 4 decades at First Atlantic Bank." He spoke eloquently about the changes he'd witnessed in the banking industry, about challenges overcome and successes achieved. He thanked mentors who had guided him and acknowledged those he had mentored in turn. The crowd was rapt, including me. This reflective, almost warm version of Richard Harrington was unfamiliar. "None of this would have been possible," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "without the support of my late wife, Elaine." My breath caught. He rarely mentioned my mother since her death. He said, "Elaine understood the sacrifices necessary for success," a slight crack in his voice. "She was my foundation during the difficult early years, and I only wish she could be here tonight to see what her support helped build." I felt tears forming. This was the most emotion I'd seen from my father in years. Perhaps retirement had softened him, opened something long closed within him. Around me, people dabbed at their eyes. Scott's hand found mine under the table. My father cleared his throat, composure returning. But a man's true legacy isn't measured in dollars or deals. It's measured in what he leaves behind, in who carries forward his values and vision. My heart lifted. Was this the moment he'd finally see me, acknowledge my different but valid path? "I've been blessed in that regard," he continued, gesturing toward the main table. "Jason has exceeded every expectation, becoming not just an investment banker, but a true financial innovator. The Reynolds merger alone would be career-defining for most, but for him, it's just another achievement in a portfolio of excellence." Jason nodded, accepting the praise as his due. "And Kimberly," my father's voice swelled with pride, "saving lives daily as one of Boston's premier surgeons. Just last month, performing a groundbreaking procedure featured in medical journals. Intelligence, discipline, precision, everything I tried to instill." Kimberly smiled demurely, her engagement ring catching the light as she touched her perfectly styled hair. My father raised his glass higher. "So tonight, as I close one chapter of my life, I look with satisfaction at what matters most. My real children are the ones who made me proud." The room burst into applause. People turned to smile at Jason and Kimberly, who accepted the attention with practiced grace. I sat frozen, the words hitting me like physical blows. My real children? As if I wasn't his child at all, as if I didn't exist or shouldn't. But worse was coming. As the applause died down, My father's gaze swept the room and landed directly on me. The temperature seemed to drop as our eyes met across the distance. "You can leave," he said, his voice perfectly audible in the now quiet room. At first, some guests looked confused, not understanding who he was addressing. Then heads began to turn toward me. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as realization dawned. My father had just publicly disowned me. My chest constricted painfully. The elegant room blurred around the edges, my vision tunneling. Blood rushed in my ears, drowning out everything except my father's cold stare and those 3 devastating words. Across the room, Aunt Patricia's hand covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Apparently, even she hadn't expected this level of cruelty. Kimberly studied her manicure, refusing to look up. Jason wore a slight smirk, as if our father had delivered a particularly clever punchline. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Dozens of eyes bored into me, witnessing my humiliation. My legs felt leaden as I slowly pushed back my chair and stood on trembling limbs. The scrape of the chair against the floor sounded abnormally loud in the hushed room. Shame burned through me like acid. This wasn't just another private disappointment. This was public rejection, a declaration that I was unworthy of even being present. I'd spent my life trying to earn my father's approval, and in one moment, he'd made it clear that I never would. I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself, desperately fighting the urge to run or burst into tears. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of breaking down. If I had to leave, I would do so with whatever dignity I could muster.
Then came the sound that changed everything. The scrape of another chair beside me. Scott stood, his movement deliberate and unhurried. His face, when I glanced at him through my haze of humiliation, showed not embarrassment, but quiet fury. A confused murmur spread through the room. My father's expression darkened, his jaw tightening at this unexpected development. He hadn't anticipated resistance to his decree, certainly not from my husband, whom he'd always viewed as an irrelevant addition to an already disappointing branch of the family tree. "Sit down," my father commanded, addressing Scott directly for perhaps the first time that evening. "This doesn't concern you." But Scott didn't sit. Instead, he straightened to his full height, his shoulders back, his gaze locked with my father's across the room. The tension was palpable, electric. No one moved. No one spoke. And then, Scott did something that would forever divide my life into before and after. Scott reached for his water glass and spoon with deliberate calm. The soft ping of metal against crystal cut through the uncomfortable silence, drawing every eye in the room. The universal signal for attention before a toast. My father's face flushed with anger at this breach of protocol. This was his night, his moment, his carefully orchestrated display of power. Scott had just challenged that in the most civilized, yet unmistakable way. "What do you think you're doing?" my father demanded, but his voice had lost some of its authority. Scott ignored him, waiting until the room was completely silent, every guest frozen in anticipation of this unexpected turn. His hand was steady as he set down the spoon, his expression composed but determined. I'd never seen this side of him before, this quiet, immovable strength. "I'd like to make a toast," Scott began, his voice clear and carrying,
to the woman Richard Harrington failed to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My heart hammered against my ribs. Beside me, an elderly woman whispered, "Oh my goodness," to her companion. For those who don't know me, I'm Scott Taylor, Amanda's husband. And since Richard has shared his perspective tonight, I'd like to share the truth about the daughter he just told to leave. My father stepped forward. "That's enough. Security will escort you out." "By all means," Scott replied evenly. But I wonder how the Boston Globe would report on Richard Harrington having his own daughter and son-in-law forcibly removed from his retirement party. I'm sure your banking colleagues would find that fascinating. 3 years ago, Scott continued, Amanda founded Lighthouse Press with her own savings and a small business loan that she qualified for without any family connections. Last year, they published Salt and Stone, which was not only shortlisted for the Massachusetts Book Award, but was just optioned for a film adaptation. Murmurs of interest swept through the crowd. This was news even to me. Scott must have received the call today and been waiting to surprise me. What Richard failed to mention is that Amanda's press has provided a platform for voices that major publishers overlooked, including veterans, immigrants, and, yes, people who grew up in emotionally abusive homes. Scott's gaze never wavered from my father. Their literacy program has put books in the hands of over 3,000 underprivileged children in Boston's poorest neighborhoods.
I felt a surreal detachment, as if watching a scene in a movie rather than my own life unfolding. Scott was publicly defending me, cataloging achievements my father had dismissed or never bothered to learn about. While Jason was crushing it on Wall Street and Kimberly was advancing her medical career, it was Amanda who took a leave of absence from college to care for her mother during cancer treatment. Amanda, who sat by Elaine's hospital bed reading her favorite poems when she was too weak to hold a book herself. My throat tightened at the memory. Those quiet hours with my mother had been sacred, painful, precious. What Richard doesn't know, Scott continued, his voice taking on an edge, is that the down payment for Jason's first New York apartment came from Amanda's college fund. She gave it to him when his credit was destroyed after that gambling problem he worked so hard to hide from Daddy. Jason's face drained of color. That had been our secret, a rare moment of real connection between siblings when he'd come to me desperate and ashamed. I'd helped him because, despite everything, he was my brother. I never expected anything in return, certainly not for him to defend me against our father. For 32 years, Richard, you've told Amanda she wasn't enough. Too sensitive, too artistic, too different from the path you prescribed. You've withheld affection, weaponized your approval, and tonight you've attempted to humiliate her in front of everyone who matters to you. Scott looked around the room, addressing the guests directly now. But here's what you should know about family. Real family doesn't require performance reviews. Real family doesn't measure love in achievements. Real family sees you, supports you, and stands with you even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. My father found his voice. You have no right to speak this way in front of my colleagues and friends. You don't know anything about our family. I know enough, Scott replied. I know that a man who publicly rejects his daughter at his retirement dinner isn't celebrating a legacy. He's revealing its bankruptcy. The room was so silent, I could hear the ice shifting in water glasses. No one moved. No one seemed to breathe. Scott turned to me then, his eyes softening. Amanda is the strongest person I know. Not because she met her father's impossible standards, but because she survived them and became herself anyway. He raised his water glass one final time, turning back to my father. So thank you, Richard Harrington, for showing us exactly the kind of parent we'll never be. With that, Scott set down his glass and gently took my hand. The warmth of his fingers around mine anchored me as the room spun with shock, embarrassment, and something else I couldn't yet identify. Together, we walked toward the exit, our footsteps echoing on the marble floor. No one tried to stop us, no one spoke. The collective breath-holding of 70 stunned guests created a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. As we neared the doors, my father found his voice again. "If you walk out now, don't ever come back," he shouted, desperation creeping into his anger. "You're cut off. Do you understand? Both of you." We didn't slow, didn't turn. Scott's hand remained steady in mine. As we passed the last table before the exit, an elderly man I recognized as one of my father's longest-serving colleagues caught my eye. Almost imperceptibly, he nodded. A small gesture of respect, or perhaps solidarity. It was the first time anyone from my father's world had acknowledged me as something other than a disappointment. The doors closed behind us, muffling the explosion of conversation that erupted in our wake. The valet, having overheard the commotion, avoided eye contact as he hurried to retrieve our car. The night air hit my flushed face like a blessing, cool and clean after the suffocating tension of the banquet hall. Scott opened the car door for me, then walked around to the driver's side. Neither of us spoke until we had pulled away from the Hawthorne, the elegant facade receding in the rearview mirror like the setting of a particularly vivid nightmare. "Are you okay?" Scott finally asked, his voice gentle in the darkness of the car. I wasn't. I was shattered, humiliated, and strangely, impossibly relieved. Something that had been coiled tightly within me for decades had finally snapped, leaving me raw, but somehow lighter. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I think I might be, eventually." Scott reached for my hand again, and we drove home in silence, leaving behind the wreckage of expectations and pretense, heading towards something I couldn't yet name, but desperately wanted to discover. The emotional dam broke as soon as we entered our apartment. I collapsed onto our couch, violent sobs tearing through me as 3 decades of suppressed pain erupted at once. Scott held me without speaking, his shirt growing damp with my tears, his arms steady around my shaking shoulders. "I'm sorry," I gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry you had to do that." "I'm not," Scott said firmly. "I've wanted to say those things to your father for 3 years." "He'll never forgive us." The thought brought fresh tears. Despite everything, some childish part of me had never stopped hoping for reconciliation, for the father I needed instead of the one I had. "That's his loss," Scott said. "And honestly, Amanda, his forgiveness isn't worth having." We stayed up until 3 in the morning talking through what had happened. The initial shock gave way to a complex mix of emotions. Grief for the relationship I'd never have with my father, anger at his cruelty, fear about family repercussions, and underneath it all, a tentative sense of liberation. "Do you think I overstepped?" Scott asked as we finally prepared for bed, the first hint of uncertainty in his voice. "You stood up for me when no one ever has," I said, "including me."
Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the phone. My father called 7 times between midnight and dawn, leaving increasingly angry voicemails demanding apologies and threatening consequences. I let each call go to voicemail, my phone screen illuminating the darkness of our bedroom like distant lightning. Morning brought a text from Kimberly. "You've always had to make everything about you. Dad's retirement was supposed to be his night. You and Scott ruined everything, as usual." I stared at the message, realizing how differently we viewed the same event. In her reality, I was the villain who had stolen our father's spotlight, not the victim of his public rejection.
He became obsessed with control, with measurable success. It was as if by perfectly organizing his world, he could keep tragedy at bay. I studied the photos, these glimpses of a father I didn't recognize. That doesn't excuse what he's done. No, she agreed, it doesn't. But I thought you should know there was a time when he loved you unreservedly. That capacity exists in him, buried under years of fear and bitterness. After she left, I placed the photos in my desk drawer, unable to look at them longer, but unwilling to throw them away. The family implosion generated ripples through our extended family network. Cousins I rarely spoke with texted for details. My father's sister-in-law called to say she'd always thought Richard was too hard on you. The family mythology was being rewritten in real time, with long-time power dynamics suddenly up for re-examination. 5 days after the dinner, my father's name on my caller ID triggered a panic attack so severe that Scott had to talk me through breathing exercises for 20 minutes. That night, he researched therapists specializing in family trauma and emotional abuse. "You need professional support," he said, showing me a short list he'd compiled. "This is beyond what I can help you process." I selected Dr. Eleanor Waters, a woman whose kind eyes and no-nonsense expression in her professional photo somehow inspired trust. My first appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. "What if this breaks me completely?" I asked Scott the night before. "What if I discover I'm even more damaged than I thought?" "You're not damaged, Amanda. You're hurt. There's a difference." He pulled me close. "And sometimes things need to break open before they can heal properly." A week after the retirement dinner disaster, my father appeared unannounced at our apartment building. The doorman called up, asking if we wanted to receive Richard Harrington. My hand shook as I held the intercom. "It's your call," Scott said. "We can refuse." "No," I decided. "Let's end this." My father looked smaller somehow as he entered our apartment. His commanding presence diminished outside his usual power settings. His eyes darted around our modest but comfortable home with thinly veiled judgment. "I've come to clear the air," he announced without greeting. "That scene at my retirement was unacceptable." "You told me to leave in front of everyone," I reminded him, my voice steadier than I expected. "What did you think would happen?" "I expected you to respect my wishes. Instead, your husband created a spectacle that undermined my entire career celebration." Scott, who had promised to let me handle this confrontation, remained silent beside me, his presence reassuring. "Did you come here to apologize?" I asked. My father looked genuinely confused. "Apologize for what? For being honest about my disappointment? I've given you every opportunity to make something of yourself, and you've rejected them all." In that moment, I saw with perfect clarity what Scott had been telling me for years. My father was incapable of seeing me as I actually was. He could only see the ways I failed to be who he wanted. "I think you should go," I said quietly. "I'm not finished.
he snapped. "I came to tell you that I've spoken with my attorney. If you and Scott don't make a public apology to me, you'll both be removed from my will. Is that clear?" The old Amanda would have crumbled, would have agreed to anything to regain his approval. But standing in my own home with my husband beside me and the life we'd built together surrounding us, I found a strength I hadn't known I possessed. "We don't want your money," I said. "We never did. What we wanted was your love, your acceptance. But I'm done trying to earn something that should have been freely given." My father's face hardened. "You'll regret this. When you're struggling to pay bills with your little book hobby, you'll wish you'd shown more respect." "I respect myself now," I said. "That's enough." He stormed out, slamming our door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. One fell, the frame cracking as it hit the floor. It was a photo from our wedding day, Scott and I laughing as we fed each other cake. I kneeled to pick it up, carefully removing the broken glass. "Symbolic," I murmured. "What is?" Scott asked. "The only thing that broke was the frame. We are still intact." He helped me clean up the shards. Neither of us spoke of my father again that night. Instead, we ordered takeout, opened wine, and discussed whether Portland might be a good place for a fresh start. The idea of moving, of creating physical distance to match the emotional reality, felt increasingly right. As I fell asleep that night, I realized I hadn't apologized for anything all day. It was a small victory, but significant for someone who had spent her life saying sorry for existing.
"Tell me about your father," Dr. Eleanor Waters said during our first therapy session. For the next 50 minutes, words poured out of me, stories I'd never fully articulated, even to Scott. Dr. Waters listened without judgment, occasionally jotting notes. At the end of the session, she looked at me thoughtfully. "Amanda, have you ever heard of emotional abuse?" That simple question began a 3-month journey through family dynamics, trauma responses, and the slow process of reclaiming my self-worth. Dr. Waters helped me see patterns I'd normalized: my father's conditional love, my siblings' roles in our dysfunctional system, my own adaptive behaviors that had once protected me but now limited me. "Healing isn't linear," she warned me. "You'll have setbacks. Days when the old beliefs feel more real than the new ones. That's normal." She was right. There were mornings I woke up convinced I was fundamentally flawed. Afternoons when criticism from a client sent me spiraling into self-doubt. Evenings when I checked my phone, hoping for a message from my father, despite everything. The panic attacks continued, sometimes triggered by specific reminders of my father, sometimes appearing without obvious cause. After particularly severe episodes, Dr. Waters suggested medication might help. "It doesn't have to be forever," she explained. "Think of it as a tool while your nervous system learns new patterns." The low-dose anti-anxiety medication made a noticeable difference within weeks. The constant background hum of dread quieted. Sleep came easier. I found myself laughing more freely with Scott, engaging more confidently at work. Meanwhile, Scott and I researched Portland in earnest. The vibrant literary scene, progressive values, and physical distance from Boston all appealed to us. We created spreadsheets comparing neighborhoods, housing costs, and potential office spaces for Lighthouse Press. "Are we running away?" I asked Scott one night as we scrolled through Portland rental listings. "We're running towards something," he corrected. "There's a difference." Our decision solidified when Scott received an unexpected job offer from a Portland-based tech company developing publishing software. The position came with a significant salary increase and the option to work remotely 3 days a week. "It's like the universe is confirming our plan," he said, showing me the email. We set a 6-month timeline for the move, giving us time to wrap up projects in Boston and transition the business thoughtfully. I was explaining these plans to Marion when her eyes widened at something over my shoulder. "Amanda Taylor." A woman approached my desk, her expensive perfume announcing her before her voice did.
I'm Vivian Newell. I was your father's executive assistant for 15 years. My stomach tightened. If my father sent you? She shook her head. Richard has no idea I'm here. I retired last month, so he can't fire me for this conversation. She glanced around. Is there somewhere we could talk privately? Over coffee in a nearby cafe, Vivian shared stories that confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed new dimensions to my father's behavior. His perfectionism and cutting remarks weren't limited to me. They extended to his staff, particularly women. He'd reduced junior associates to tears, taken credit for others' ideas, and held grudges for years over minor infractions. The night of that retirement dinner, 3 longtime colleagues approached me separately to say they'd always thought Richard was unnecessarily harsh with you. Your husband's speech, it resonated with many people who'd experienced your father's darker side. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Vivian stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Because for 15 years, I watched you try to win the approval of a man who moves the goalposts every time someone gets close. I watched you blame yourself for his inability to show love, and I stayed silent. She reached across the table, briefly touching my hand. I'm not staying silent anymore.
The twist came at 10:17 a.m. when Jason called. I almost didn't answer, expecting more accusations, but something made me pick up. That was quite a show last night, he said, his tone unreadable. I didn't plan it, I replied stiffly. A pause. I know. Another pause. Is it true what Scott said about the apartment money? Yes. Why didn't you ever throw that in my face? All these years, even when I was less than supportive. Because that's not why I helped you, I said simply. The silence stretched between us. Finally, Jason spoke again, his voice different somehow, smaller. I never thanked you properly for that, and I should have. It doesn't matter now. Maybe it does. He cleared his throat. Listen, what Dad did last night, it wasn't right. I've never seen him like that. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to solidarity Jason had offered in years. After we hung up, I sat staring at the phone, unsure what to make of the shift. At work that Monday, my boss, Marion, took one look at my face and ushered me into her office. You look like you've been through a war, she said, pouring me coffee. What happened? I gave her the condensed version. Her response was immediate. Take the week off. We'll manage the Hopkins manuscript without you. I can't just stop working because of family drama, I protested. Amanda, she said gently, if you'd broken your leg, you'd take time off to heal. Your father broke something inside you. That deserves the same consideration. I reluctantly agreed to 3 days, spending them alternating between crying jags and numb television binging. Scott worked from home, keeping me company while respecting my need to process. The outside world continued, oblivious to my internal earthquake. On Thursday, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Aunt Patricia clutching a large manila envelope and looking uncharacteristically uncertain. May I come in? She asked. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She perched awkwardly on our couch, refusing coffee or tea. What my brother did was unforgivable, she said without preamble. I should have said something that night, and I didn't. I've been enabling Richard's behavior for years, telling myself it was just his way. She handed me the envelope. Inside were old family photographs I'd never seen. My mother, pregnant with me, looking radiant. toddler me on my father's shoulders, both of us laughing. A family vacation where my father was teaching me to fish, his expression patient and kind. "He wasn't always like this," Aunt Patricia said softly. "After your mother got sick the first time, something changed in Richard."
That conversation with Vivian was unexpected validation, external confirmation that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated my father's treatment. It strengthened my resolve to build a new life unshackled from his influence. In the following weeks, I reached out to cousins on my mother's side, whom I'd lost touch with after her death. To my surprise, many welcomed the reconnection. My mother's sister, Judith, invited Scott and I for a weekend at her Connecticut home, where she shared family stories and photographs I'd never seen. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become," Aunt Judith told me, showing me my mother's college journals. "She was an artist too, you know, before she met your father and adopted his priorities." This glimpse into my mother's unfulfilled creative ambitions created a new sense of connection with her. I'd always thought my artistic tendencies came from nowhere, an anomaly in a family of practical professionals. Learning they were an inheritance from my mother felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity. Months after the retirement dinner incident, I was giving a speech at a small literary event about Lighthouse Press's mission to amplify overlooked voices. Halfway through, I realized I was speaking confidently, without the constant internal editing and self-doubt that had previously accompanied any public appearance. "You were magnificent," Scott said afterward, as we celebrated with a group of authors and industry colleagues. "I didn't picture my father's disapproving face once," I marveled, "not even when I stumbled over that author's name." "It was a breakthrough," Dr. Waters acknowledged in our next session. "You're internalizing a new voice," she observed. "Your own voice of self-acceptance is becoming louder than his voice of criticism." Our Portland plans progressed. A house hunting trip yielded a charming craftsman with a converted garage, perfect for a small office. We put a deposit down, the commitment to our fresh start now concrete. Back in Boston, I expanded Lighthouse Press's mission, creating a special imprint for memoirs focused on family reconciliation and healing from emotional abuse. The project felt both professionally exciting and personally meaningful, a way to transform my pain into purpose. My relationship with Jason continued its tentative thaw. He called occasionally, our conversations gradually becoming less superficial. During one such call, he confessed that he'd started therapy himself. That night at Dad's retirement, it forced me to look at some things I'd been avoiding, he admitted, like how I've spent my entire adult life chasing Dad's approval, and how exhausting that is. Kimberly remained firmly in my father's camp, sending a formal wedding invitation addressed only to Scott, with a post-it note reading, "No drama, please." We declined with an equally formal response card and a generous gift from their registry. 6 months after the retirement dinner, Scott and I were discussing starting a family, a conversation I'd always avoided, fearing I'd inherited my father's capacity for emotional damage. "What if I'm like him?" I whispered, naming my deepest fear. "What if I don't know how to love a child unconditionally?" "The fact that you're asking that question means you won't be like him," Scott said. "You're aware of the patterns. You're doing the work to heal them." That night, I had a breakthrough therapy session where I finally expressed my rage toward my father without tempering it with understanding or excuses. Dr. Waters encouraged me to write him a letter I'd never send, pouring out decades of hurt and anger. "I hate what you did to me," I wrote, my pen pressing so hard it tore the paper in places. "I hate that you made me believe I was fundamentally flawed. I hate that even now, part of me still craves your approval." The release was cathartic. Afterward, I realized it had been weeks since I'd thought about my father daily. His power over my emotional state was diminishing, his absence becoming less of a wound and more of a fact. Our last week in Boston, I received an unexpected email from my father's former colleague, the elderly man who had nodded to me as Scott and I left the retirement dinner. "I'm retiring to Portland myself next month," he wrote. "Richard and I had a falling out recently over his treatment of a young analyst that reminded me of his behavior toward you. If you and Scott are settled by then, perhaps we could meet for coffee. Sometimes chosen family is more important than biological connections." As we packed our belongings into a moving truck, I found the envelope of old photographs Aunt Patricia had given me. Looking at them now produced less pain, as if they depicted characters in a story rather than my actual family. I packed them alongside newer photos, Scott and me hiking in New Hampshire, our literary festival booth surrounded by readers, a dinner party with friends who loved us exactly as we were. On our last night in the empty Boston apartment, Scott found me standing at the window, looking out at the city lights. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "No," I said truthfully, "just saying goodbye to the person I was here, the one who never felt good enough." "She was always good enough," Scott said. "She just couldn't see it yet." As we drove west the next morning, I realized I hadn't checked my phone for messages from my father in over a week. It wasn't a conscious decision, just a natural fading of an old habit that no longer served me. The constant ache of his rejection had transformed into something different, not absence of pain, but presence of self-respect. Portland welcomed us with a week of unseasonable sunshine, as if affirming our decision. As we unpacked boxes in our new home, I came across the cracked wedding picture frame from the night of my father's final visit. I'd kept the frame, but replaced the glass. "I think this belongs here," I said, placing it on the mantel of our new living room. A reminder of what we brought with us and what we left behind. Scott smiled, understanding perfectly. "The past made us who we are," he said, "but it doesn't get to decide who we become." 1 year after my father's retirement dinner, I stood in our Portland kitchen cradling a glass of sparkling cider. Through the window, I could see Scott grilling on our back deck, surrounded by our new friends and chosen family. Spring sunshine filtered through cherry blossoms, casting dappled light across our yard. The past year had brought changes I couldn't have imagined that painful night in Boston. Lighthouse Press had flourished in Portland's supportive literary community, winning a Small Business Innovation Award for our community outreach programs. My therapy sessions with Dr. Waters had transitioned from weekly to monthly check-ins. And most significantly, I was 4 months pregnant with our first child. "Need any help?" asked Aunt Patricia, who had flown out for our housewarming party. Her relationship with my father had grown strained after she continued maintaining contact with me. But at 68, she'd finally decided to prioritize her own values over family harmony. "I'm good, thanks," I smiled, handing her a plate of appetizers to carry outside. The doorbell rang as I was arranging a cheese board. I opened it to find Jason, looking travel-rumpled but smiling tentatively. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "Flight from New York was delayed." I hugged him, still getting used to this new, warmer relationship we were building. Over the past year, we'd progressed from awkward phone calls to genuine conversations. He'd visited Portland twice, each time opening up more about his own struggles with our father's expectations. "Come in," I said. "Everyone's out back. How's Claire?" Jason had recently started dating a kindergarten teacher who seemed to bring out a gentler side of him. "She's good, wanted to come, but she couldn't get the time off." He hesitated, then handed me an envelope. "I've been debating whether to show you this, but I think you should know." Inside was a short article from a Boston business publication featuring a small photograph of my father. The headline read, "Former First Atlantic EVP Richard Harrington hospitalized after minor stroke." "He's physically okay," Jason added quickly, seeing my expression, "but it's been a wake-up call. He's alone a lot now. Kimberly visits when she can, but her surgical residency keeps her busy. He refused to hire help initially, but after he burned dinner and set off the smoke alarms, the neighbors called me. I studied the photo of my father. He looked older, diminished somehow. "I'm sorry to hear he's unwell," I said honestly, "but I don't know what you expect me to do with this information." Jason shrugged. "Nothing, necessarily. I just thought you should know." I placed the article on the counter, promising myself I'd process it later. Today was about celebration, not reopening old wounds. The party flowed around me, a joyful gathering of people who supported us. My colleagues from Lighthouse Press chatted with Scott's tech friends, and Patricia exchanged gardening tips with our next-door neighbor. Jason gradually relaxed, showing uncharacteristic interest in one of our authors' discussions about narrative therapy. As evening approached, Scott called for everyone's attention, raising his glass. "1 year ago, Amanda and I made the best decision of our lives, moving to Portland. But the journey started earlier, with a moment of truth at a certain retirement dinner. Knowing glances were exchanged among those familiar with our story. That night could have broken us, but instead it freed us." He turned to me, his eyes soft. "To Amanda, who taught me that real strength isn't about never falling, but about rising every time life knocks you down. And to all of you who've become our Portland family, thank you for welcoming us exactly as we are." Glasses clinked as everyone toasted. Standing there, surrounded by genuine affection, I felt a completeness I'd spent decades searching for. The validation I desperately sought from my father had always been a mirage, disappearing as I approached. Real acceptance, I'd learned, didn't require contorting myself to meet someone else's expectations. After our guests departed, Jason helped us clean up, uncharacteristically domestic, as he loaded the dishwasher. "I have a confession," he said, folding a dish towel with unexpected precision. "I've been seeing a therapist for 8 months now." "That's great, Jason," I said, genuinely pleased. "It's changing how I see everything. Dad, myself, you." He leaned against the counter. "Did you know I was jealous of you growing up?" I nearly dropped the plate I was rinsing. "Jealous of me? You were the golden child." "I was the obedient child," he corrected. "I did everything Dad wanted and got his approval, sure. But you always knew who you were. Even when it cost you everything, you stayed true to yourself. I never had that kind of courage." We talked late into the night after Scott went to bed, sharing perspectives on our childhood that made me see familiar events through new eyes. When Jason finally left for his hotel, he hugged me tightly. "I'm sorry I wasn't a better brother," he whispered. "We're writing a new story now," I reminded him. "That's what matters." 3 days later, while visiting Powell's Books, I received a text from Kimberly. The first direct communication in months. "Dad asking for you. Probably nothing. Just thought you should know." I stood frozen among the bookshelves, my hand instinctively moving to my slightly rounded belly. The old Amanda would have dropped everything, rushed back to Boston, desperate for this potential opening. The new Amanda recognized the message for what it was. Kimberly's way of transferring responsibility, of making any continued estrangement my choice rather than our father's. After careful consideration and a long talk with Scott, I composed a simple response. "Thank you for letting me know. I hope he recovers well." Not a door slammed shut, but not a desperate rush through an open one either. Just acknowledgement of a shared humanity that existed independent of our broken relationship. 2 weeks later, I had a chance encounter that crystallized how far I'd come. While visiting a friend in the hospital after minor surgery, I rounded a corner and nearly collided with my father. He looked startled, then wary. He'd lost weight, and a slight droop affected one side of his face, evidence of the stroke Jason had mentioned. "Amanda," he said, his voice rougher than I remembered. "Dad," I replied, surprised by my steady calm. "Jason mentioned you were having some health issues. I hope you're doing better." He nodded stiffly. "Just a checkup, nothing serious." We stood awkwardly in the hospital corridor, medical staff flowing around us like a stream around 2 stubborn rocks. "You look different," he finally said. I smiled slightly.
I'm pregnant, due in November. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps a hint of some deeper emotion, quickly suppressed.
I see. Congratulations. Thank you. Another silence stretched between us, filled with decades of things unsaid. I realized I was waiting for something. An apology, perhaps, or some acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. But his expression remained carefully neutral, his posture rigid. I should go, I said finally. My friend is waiting. He nodded. Give my regards to Scott. It was such a conventional pleasantry, so at odds with our last interaction, that I almost laughed. Instead, I simply nodded and moved past him, continuing down the corridor. What struck me afterward wasn't what happened, but what hadn't. No accelerated heartbeat, no tunnel vision, no desperate need to make him love me. I'd spoken to my father as one adult to another, without the weight of my childhood wounds dictating my responses. The encounter left me contemplative, but not devastated. He'll never change, I told Scott that night. Not fundamentally. Probably not, Scott agreed. Are you okay with that? I considered the question carefully. I think I am. For the first time, I truly understand that his limitations aren't my failure. That autumn, as the Portland trees turned brilliant shades of orange and red, we prepared our home for the baby. Jason visited twice, bringing impractically extravagant gifts for his future niece or nephew. Aunt Patricia sent handmade quilts and regular updates on family news, including the gossip that my father had been seeing a woman from his church, a widow who apparently tolerated his difficult personality. Good for him, I said when I heard, genuinely meaning it. His happiness or unhappiness no longer defined my own. In late November, our daughter, Lily Eleanor Taylor, was born after 20 hours of labor. Holding her for the first time, I was overwhelmed by a love so fierce and unconditional it brought tears to my eyes. She's perfect, Scott whispered, gently touching her tiny fingers. Looking at our daughter's peaceful face, I made a silent promise. She would grow up knowing she was enough, exactly as she was. Her worth would never be tied to achievements or conformity to someone else's vision. She would be loved for her authentic self, whatever shape that took. Jason flew in to meet his niece the following week, awkwardly cradling her with a mixture of terror and wonder. She has mom's eyes, he observed, touching her cheek gently. I thought so too, I said, glad someone else had noticed the connection to our mother. He hesitated, then added, I told Dad about her. He didn't say much, but he asked to see a picture. I nodded, neither encouraged nor distressed by the information. My father was now a peripheral figure in my story, no longer its defining force. As Christmas approached, we held a small dinner for our chosen family, friends who had become essential to our Portland life. Jason and his now serious girlfriend Claire and Aunt Patricia. Our home glowed with warmth and laughter. Lily passed from loving arms to loving arms as we shared food and stories. After dinner, as we gathered in the living room with dessert, Scott proposed a toast. To family, he said simply. Not just the one we're born into, but the one we create through love and choice. To family, everyone echoed, glasses raised. Looking around at these people who accepted me completely, who saw my strengths and weaknesses and loved me anyway, I finally understood the lesson of that painful retirement dinner a year and a half ago. What had seemed like an ending, the final rejection by my father, had actually been a beginning. By standing up and walking out with Scott that night, I'd taken the first step toward finding my true home.
Lily began to fuss, and I excused myself to nurse her in the quiet of her nursery. Rocking gently in the chair Scott had restored for us, I studied my daughter's perfect face and felt a peace I'd never known before. You will never have to earn my love, I whispered to her. It's already yours, completely and forever. In that moment, I realized I had given myself the same gift, unconditional acceptance of who I was, separate from achievements or external validation. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still difficult days, but I had found my way to a truth that had eluded me for 32 years. I was enough. I had always been enough. The sound of laughter drifted from the living room, and Lily's tiny hand gripped my finger with surprising strength. This was my legacy now, not my father's disappointment, but my daughter's future. Not a path dictated by someone else's values, but one I was creating with each authentic choice. What's your story of finding freedom from toxic family expectations? Have you ever had someone stand up for you when you couldn't stand up for yourself? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear that they too are enough, exactly as they are. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. Remember, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is walk away from what hurts us toward what helps us heal.